When I was young, people liked to talk about money as though money itself were complicated. They spoke in a tone that suggested the economy was some giant machine hidden behind a steel wall, understood only by professors, central bankers, and men in dark suits who enjoyed using long words. I never believed that. I believed the world was usually simpler than the language used to describe it, not easier, simpler. And over time, I learned that most of the great economic errors people make are not caused by mathematics being too hard. They are caused by people refusing to look at what actually moves behavior. They look at intentions. They should be looking at incentives. They look at wishes. They should be looking at trade-offs. They look at headlines. They should be looking at prices. They look at what sounds fair. They should be looking at what causes supply to appear or disappear. That is the whole difference. Once you understand that, a great deal of modern political theater loses its power over you. A great deal of business talk becomes easier to judge. A great deal of personal life becomes easier to clean up. Because economics is not only a subject about nations, it is a subject about human behavior under constraints. And constraints, unlike speeches, have a habit of telling the truth. I have seen people ruin businesses because they confused hope with incentive. I have seen cities ruin neighborhoods because they confused compassion with price control. I have seen smart young people waste years because they never learned that every yes automatically contains a no to something else. They thought life was a menu. It is not. It is an exchange. Always, you are always paying with something, sometimes cash, sometimes time, sometimes peace, sometimes future opportunity, sometimes the invisible growth that money could have become if you had not used it for something smaller today. This is why I say the economy is not confusing in the way people think. It is morally uncomfortable. That is different. It forces you to see that wanting a result does not create a result. It forces you to see that prices, profits, losses, wages, and trade are not moral decorations. They are signals. If you ignore them, the world punishes you if you understand them. The world still does not become easy, but it becomes much harder for you to be fooled. That is the real reward. The source material you gave me is built around that same spine. It uses examples from taxes, price controls, trade-offs, wages, profits, and international exchange to show that people respond to incentives rather than intentions. And that ignoring this simple fact is how individuals and governments both get themselves into trouble. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 80 File 0 Fay, that is the first principle. People respond to rewards, not sermons, not hopes, not what politicians say should happen, not what professors say would be fair if human beings behaved like obedient chess pieces. People respond to the payoff structure placed in front of them. And once you accept that, a lot of false sophistication disappears. Take the question of taxing the rich. Now, I know how that topic is usually framed. It is wrapped in moral language immediately. Those who have more should contribute more. Those who are doing well can afford it. Perhaps so. The real question is not whether a line like that feels satisfying. The real question is what behavior the policy rewards. The source text uses the Maryland millionaire tax example for exactly this reason. It describes how lawmakers expected to collect more by taxing high earners more aggressively, only to discover that a meaningful number of those earners changed location or behavior, leading to results far different from the original intention. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn. 80 File 0 Fay. That is the part people hate. They hate it because it sounds as if economics is being disrespectful to morality. It is not. It is simply refusing to let morality replace causality. If you raise taxes on a population mobile enough to leave, then part of what you are doing is rewarding movement. You may wish they would stay. You may even think they should stay. The world does not grade your policy by how noble your wish felt. It grades the policy by what people actually do next. This is one of the great adult lessons. Do not ask first what outcome you desire. Ask what behavior your system rewards. That sentence belongs in politics. It belongs in business. It belongs in parenting. It belongs in marriage. It belongs in every room where human beings imagine they are controlling other human beings through declarations alone. If your employee is rewarded for looking busy rather than producing, you will get theater. If your child is rewarded for excuses rather than responsibility, you will get excuses. If your tax code rewards movement, you will get movement. If your welfare system rewards non-work more than work at the margin, you should not act surprised when work becomes less attractive in some cases. And if your own life rewards short-term emotional comfort every time discipline starts to hurt, then your future will fill with unfinished things. That is economics in the private sense. We are all responding to some structure. The wise person asks what structure he is actually living inside. The foolish person keeps asking why reality refuses to cooperate with his feelings. Now let us move to the second principle, which may be even more important because it follows you all day long whether you understand it or not. Every choice has a cost, not a visible cost only, a hidden cost, an alternative cost, the cost of what had to die so that this thing could live. The source text explains this with the most ordinary examples first, then expands to nations. It says if you spend your $10 on one thing, you cannot also spend the same $10 on something else, and that the same logic applies to time, labor, national resources, and every decision made by individuals or governments. Faithful site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. A lot of people imagine economics is mainly about money. It is actually about sacrifice, not in the melodramatic sense, in the arithmetic sense. When you buy something, you do not only spend what the item costs, you surrender everything else that money might have become. The world is full of adults pretending not to know this. They say, I can afford it. Fine, that is one question. The better one is this. What am I giving up in order to afford it? If a man buys the expensive car, he did not merely buy leather seats and a badge. He also bought the future that the extra capital would have built elsewhere. The source text uses the familiar BMW versus Corolla example to make this opportunity. Cost lesson vivid, showing how a seemingly reasonable upgrade can turn into a very large lost future sum once time and compounding are considered faithful site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay. That is the right way to teach it. Because people underestimate visible spending and completely ignore invisible forfeiture. The invisible forfeiture is usually the more important number. You did not just buy the car. You also killed the investment that money might have become. You did not just spend the evening scrolling. You also killed the deeper work that time might have produced. You did not just say yes to one mediocre client. You also said no to the cleaner schedule that might have made room for a better one. This is why I have always thought adulthood is largely the process of becoming conscious of trade-offs. Children want everything. Adults understand sequencing. A mature investor, a mature spouse, a mature manager, a mature citizen all understand some version of the same truth. To choose is to cut. That is not tragedy. It is structure. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking whether you can have everything. You start asking what is worth sacrificing for. That is a much more profitable question. Now, let us go one layer deeper. Prices are messages. This is a phrase too many people hear and too few understand. They hear price as if it were merely a punishment, too high, too painful, too unfair. That is the emotional reaction. The economic reaction should be different. What is this price trying to tell me? The source document uses the food system to explain this point. It argues that no central planner could ever possess enough real-time knowledge to direct the endless flow of goods through a modern society, and that prices do the coordination work by signaling scarcity, abundance, demand, and the urgency of production far more efficiently than any politician or committee could. Fay file site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay. That is exactly the lesson. The price is not just a number on a tag. It is compressed information. It says many people want this, or not enough people want this. It says production is difficult here, or supply is rushing in. It says too many people are chasing too little of something, or too little demand is chasing too much. When the price of hotel rooms rises in a city on the weekend of a major event, people complain, of course they do, but the price is saying something useful. Scarcity is real. The higher price is not an insult invented by the hotel. It is the signal that space is limited relative to desire. Without that signal, people pretend the scarcity does not exist until the rooms simply disappear. And that, in a way, is the larger point. People hate the messenger when the messenger is honest. A price is honest in a way politicians often are not. The politician says he will make everything affordable. The price says demand is outrunning supply. The politician says we will protect consumers. The price says there is not enough to go around at this level. The politician says we can solve it. The price says solve the scarcity or the problem remains. This is why I have always respected prices more than speeches. Prices are not always pleasant. They are usually truthful. Now, once people hear that, they often commit the next error. They say, if prices are painful, let us control them. That is where all the sentimental damage begins. The source text walks through this with rent control, food shortages, and guaranteed crop prices. It argues that setting prices below what the market would bear creates shortages and deterioration, while setting prices above reality creates surpluses, waste, and rot. Fay file site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay, that is the simplest great truth in economics. If you force the price below reality, demand rises and supply weakens. If you force the price above reality, supply swells and demand slackens. In both cases, you are not defeating reality. You are rearranging the way reality punishes people. That is all. Rent control sounds compassionate when first spoken. Cheaper rent. Who could object? But if cheaper rent means more people want units at the lower price, while fewer landlords want to maintain, improve, or even provide those units, then the city has not eliminated scarcity. It has only pushed scarcity into a different form. The source material uses New York as the illustration and explains how controlled rents can lead existing tenants to hold on to apartments longer than they otherwise would, while landlords reduce maintenance or abandon economics that no longer make sense. Fay file site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay, that is exactly what happens when you suppress the price signal without solving the underlying shortage. The apartment does not become morally more available because a law was written. Demand crowds in supply, loses its incentive. Maintenance weakens, new construction becomes less attractive, and then people stand in a city full of housing tension wondering why good intentions failed. They failed because the intention was not paired with a structure that produced more supply. This is why I say price controls are really just emotional impatience made into law. They are the insistence that the message must change before the reality changes. Reality never agrees to that bargain. The same with food. If you force the selling price below the cost that makes production worthwhile, then suppliers slow down or disappear. People are then shocked that shelves empty. They should not be shocked. They have removed the incentive to bring the product on the other side. If you guarantee a very high price for a crop, then farmers may flood the system with that crop beyond what the population needs. Because the incentive became too attractive, the source text uses India wheat experience as an example of that opposite problem, where guaranteed prices encouraged overproduction, leading to massive stockpiles and waste. Fay file site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay. Again, same truth. Price is a message. When you muffle the message, you do not create harmony, you create distortions. And distortions are simply scarcity or surplus wearing political makeup. I would rather hear the truth early than live inside the lie until shelves empty or warehouses rot. Now let us turn to profits and losses, because here too the public tells itself a moral fable instead of learning the mechanism. People like profits when they belong to them. They distrust profits when they belong to someone else. They treat losses as tragic when they happen to visible companies. But profits and losses are not compliments or insults. They are directions. The source document makes this point through simple school lunch analogies and then expands it into the broader economy. It says profit tells producers to continue because they are creating something people value enough to pay for, while loss tells them to stop because resources are being used for something less valuable than alternative uses. Fay file site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. A profit says more of this please, a loss says less of this. Please, what makes this important is not the emotional experience of the entrepreneur. It is the allocation of scarce resources. If a business is profitable, that often means labor, capital, materials, and time are being combined into something people genuinely want badly enough to pay for. If a business loses money consistently, that usually means those same resources could be serving people better elsewhere. The loss is not only bad news for the owner, it is useful news for the system. That is why I have always been suspicious of the phrase, too big to fail. Often what that really means is too politically visible to be allowed to stop wasting resources. The source material says exactly this in simpler language. It argues that when governments rescue persistently failing firms, they can break the signal that losses are supposed to send, which keeps labor, capital, and materials trapped in weaker, uses longer than they should be. Fay file site Fay turn 80 file 0 Fay, that is correct. A loss is a mercy when it arrives early. It says, stop, turn around. Do something better. To subsidize permanent failure is often to subsidize denial. This is true in business and in private life. A side project losing money for 3 years is not a sign of loyalty. It may be a sign that the market is telling you something you do not want to hear. A habit that keeps costing more than it returns is not a noble struggle. It may be a loss waiting to be acknowledged. If you kill it, the resources come back, time comes back, attention comes back, capital comes back, energy comes back. Now they can be placed where they belong. That is why I say losses are directions, painful directions, perhaps still directions. The next lesson is one that offends people because it sounds too unsentimental. Your wage is a price too. The source text explains this through a lemonade stand example and then extends it to employment more broadly. It argues that wages are not set by moral worth or effort alone, but by the economic value of what a worker adds at the margin. Fe philocite fe turn 80 file 0 fe that is exactly the right way to think. A worker's dignity is infinite in the moral sense. His wage is not determined in the moral sense. It is determined in the market sense. The world does not pay you according to how tired you feel. It does not pay you according to how noble your intentions are. It pays according to how much value your work creates relative to alternatives. This is not an insult, it is a measurement problem. If a worker helps create $10 of additional value per HR, he cannot be paid $15 indefinitely without somebody else subsidizing the difference. The source text uses that exact logic when discussing minimum wages and marginal productivity, arguing that if a legally required wage rises far above the value created by the least productive workers, employers will respond by not hiring them, cutting hours, or substituting machines. Fe philocite fe turn 80 file 0 fe, that is the uncomfortable truth. People want wages to be a declaration of justice. The market treats wages more like bids on output. You may dislike that. You are still living inside it. That is why the real way to earn more over time is not to wish harder. It is to become attached to higher value output. Learn the skill harder to replace. Move closer to revenue. Move closer to decisions. Move closer to customers. Move closer to scarcity. This is what the ambitious person should understand. You are not being paid for the exhaustion itself. You are being paid for what the exhaustion produces in market terms. That is why some backbreaking jobs pay less than some softer-looking jobs. The question is not visible suffering. The question is marginal value and replaceability. Again, cold. Again. Now, many people hear this and become defensive. They think economics is disrespecting virtue. It is not. It is simply refusing to confuse compassion with pricing. A compassionate society may choose to help people whose labor is not currently rewarded enough by the market. That is a separate discussion from pretending the market price itself means something other than what it means. Confusing those two conversations has made a mess of public thinking for decades. Now let us move to what may be the most misunderstood subject of all, because politicians have learned how effectively fear can be sold through it. Trade the Source document spends a great deal of time on this point. It argues that trade is not a war with winners and losers, but a mutually beneficial exchange, and that even when one country is more efficient at producing many things, comparative advantage still makes specialization and exchange beneficial for both sides. Fe philocite fe turn 80 file 0 fe that is precisely right. Trade is not theft when entered voluntarily. It is cooperation. Two parties exchange because each believes he will be better off afterward. That is the entire moral core of trade. A man with pizza trades with a man who has sandwiches because each values what the other holds more than the thing he is giving up at that moment. No one was robbed. Both gained. Scale that logic up to firms, cities, and nations, and the principle does not disappear. It becomes more important. The public keeps getting fooled by zero-sum language because conflict is emotionally vivid. We are losing. They are winning. We need to beat them. Those are powerful sentences. They are often poor economics. The better question is not whether one country sold more shirts and another sold more chips. The better question is whether both sides ended up with more total value than if they each tried to do everything alone. The source text uses the familiar comparative advantage logic to explain this. It says even if one side is better at producing many things, trade can still enrich both if each specializes where its relative advantage is greater. Fe philocite fe turn 80 file 0 fe that is a beautiful idea because it humbles ego. A man may be able to do his own bookkeeping, mop his own floors, design his own website, clean his own office, and answer his own email. The question is not whether he can. The question is whether he should. If an hour of his highest value work produces $300 and an hour of someone else's labor to clean or organize costs 20 or 30, then insisting on doing everything himself is not discipline. It is waste disguised as self-sufficiency. The same principle works across nations. Focus where your advantage is strongest. Trade for the rest. Everyone can end up richer in real terms than if everyone were forced into self-contained mediocrity. Now, there are always transition pains in trade. Factories close, skills lose value, regions change. I do not deny that. The solution, however, is not to pretend trade itself is theft. The solution is to understand both its benefits and its disruptions honestly, then deal with the disruptions without lying about the economics. That is adult policy thinking. Very little of it is adult. Now, after all of this, let me say what I think the real value of economics is. It will not make you rich by itself. It will do something more reliable than that. It will make you harder to fool. The source text ends on essentially this same note, saying that understanding economics may not automatically enrich you, but it makes it much harder for politicians, slogans, or shallow explanations to trick you. Fay Philocite, Fay turn 80, file 0 Fay, that is exactly right. A person who understands incentives becomes harder to manipulate through rhetoric. A person who understands trade-offs becomes harder to seduce with consumer nonsense. A person who understands price signals becomes harder to recruit into bad policy. A person who understands profits and losses becomes better at seeing whether a business or even a life pattern is creating or destroying value. A person who understands wages as prices becomes more honest about how to increase his earning power. A person who understands trade becomes less likely to confuse voluntary exchange with war. This is why I would tell any young person the same thing. Study economics not because it will hand you a formula for becoming wealthy overnight. Study it because it will strip illusions out of your thinking. Once illusions are stripped out, the world becomes less comfortable in one sense and much more manageable in another. You stop asking sentimental questions, you start asking causal questions. What is being rewarded here? What is being sacrificed here? What signal is the price sending? What will happen to supply if you force the price lower? What resources or losses trying to liberate? What value do I actually create? What am I good at that I should double down on instead of trying to patch every weakness equally? What trait am I refusing out of ego? Those are the kinds of questions that lead to a very strong life. Not because they make everything easy, because they keep you from living inside comforting lies for too long. And comforting lies are expensive. This is true in policy. It is true in business. It is true in investing. It is true in marriage. It is true in parenting. It is true in the quiet daily question of whether your habits are rewarding the self you want to become or the self that wants the easiest relief available tonight. Everything comes back to incentives. Everything comes back to trade-offs. That is why I found Thomas Sowell so useful when I first read him, not because he gave me some grand ideology to wear like a team jersey, because he kept returning to the same severe truth. Reality does not care what sounds kind if the incentives point somewhere else. A policy can be sold as compassion and still create scarcity. A tax can be sold as fairness and still drive away the very base it hoped to milk. A wage law can sound generous and still price the weakest worker out of the market. A subsidy can sound like support and still trap capital in weak hands. A spending decision can feel harmless and still cost $250,000 in future compounding. A refusal to trade can feel patriotic and still leave everyone with less. This is why I have always preferred logic over sentiment in money matters. Not because sentiment is evil, because it is incomplete. Sentiment can tell you what outcome you wish for. Economics tells you what path is more likely to lead there. You need both in life. But when the two conflict, it is usually expensive to ignore the second one. So if I were sitting across from someone who had just finished this material and was asking me what to remember, I would say it very simply. Stop asking what sounds good. Ask what changes behavior. Stop asking what looks affordable. Ask what it costs in alternative futures. Stop blaming prices for telling you scarcity exists. Stop pretending that forced prices can erase scarcity. Stop treating profits as greed and losses as shame. They are signals. Stop imagining your wage as a moral certificate. It is a market number tied to output. Stop talking about trade like a fistfight. It is usually cooperation with arithmetic. And above all, stop expecting the world to reward intentions when incentives point the other way. That one misunderstanding has ruined more policies, more businesses, and more private lives than almost any other. The world is not arranged around what should happen. It is arranged around what people are rewarded for doing. Once you see that clearly, you become calmer, harsher in some judgments perhaps, but calmer because now the world stops looking random. You begin to see the gears. And when you can see the gears, you can build your life with them instead of forever getting caught in them. That is not everything, but it is a very good beginning. A beginning strong enough, if held on to make you difficult to fool and difficult to push around. And that, in my experience, is worth a great deal more than most people realize when they first start learning how the world actually works.